Is there all this anxiety, stress, distress, uncertainty? Is that natural? And what are we supposed to do to try to cope with it during these weeks and months ahead?
Generations and generations of evolution have given us the stress response. And that is the natural, as you put it, Zeke, the natural physiological and psychological response to threats. And if you're not feeling stressed right now, then something's wrong with you, right? And I think people need to hear that when you're having trouble sleeping, when everything is disrupted and you're not yourself, you're irritable, that's the stress response. And I can explain why, but it's actually part of survival. It's actually, if you manage it the right way, adaptive.
Angela, when we talk about people suffering, one of the things you've said is that in this crisis, each of us has a choice between feeling like nobody understands how we feel, or in contrast, feeling like we're all suffering together. And that's a tough one, because when you're actually physically alone, when you're actually not with your schoolmates or with your coworkers, you can feel like you are going through this alone, except much of the world's going through it with you.
You know, I think it's not only that, Ali. I think that's a big part of it, right? And there are some people who haven't seen another human being in quite a long time. But I think just as difficult, it's that the pandemic is affecting different houses, different individuals, different countries differently. So some people, the thing that they wake up in the middle of the night worrying about is the bills that they won't be able to pay the next day. There are other people, like the college graduates you just, they have slightly different worries. Am I going to get a job? What's going to happen to my career? Then you have people who are, caring for sick relatives or worrying about relatives that they think are sick, but they can't go and travel to see. So I think the isolation isn't just physical. It's actually in part that you can kind of think a lot if you choose to pay attention to the fact that your suffering is so different. And I've been on Zoom calls where people are complaining about Zoom fatigue. And I am sure that if there were unemployed people listening to that, they would feel like that was totally tone deaf, that, each person is suffering in their own way. It's easy to feel like there's a lot of, there's a lack, I should say, of empathy.
So, Angela, what do we do to manage this stress? Are there, to get us control over our life and to get us control so that we can think that things are going to be okay in the future, even though we don't control all the variables?
Well, just extending what I was saying about feeling alone, because I think the stress response is normal, but when you experience the stress response and you feel like you're in it by yourself, as opposed to in this predicament with other people, it's much, much worse. And I'm thinking in particular of a study that was done at West Point, the oldest military academy in the United States. And this is now 20 years ago, but researchers wanted to understand the stress response, and they were looking at biomarkers of stress from these cadets. And here's the interesting finding. The scientists thought that at the time when you first start training, that was going to be the peak of all these stress biomarkers. That was going to be the hardest part of West Point. It's when a lot of people drop out. But actually, in fact, there was no difference between that really objectively stressful time and baseline. And actually, later on during finals, when you were surely going to stay at West Point, that's when stress peaked. Now, they were really puzzled. They were confused. And so they actually started interviewing these cadets. And here's what they learned. When these cadets were going through this really, really hard training, and right, some of them were dropping out, in fact, they felt like they were all in it together. They felt like they were, as a group, battling a common enemy, which was training. Then at finals, they felt like they were pitted against each other, being ranked. And that's why when they felt like they were together, the stress biomarkers were low. But when they felt like they were in things alone against one another, they felt like stress was, the markers went high. And I think there's a lesson, particularly for our country, because we seem so good at being polarized and fighting with each other. I really do feel like paying attention to the fact that really the pandemic is influencing every single person. Nobody is coming out of this unscathed. And I think that might help us manage the stress response in an adaptive way.
Angela, you've written so much about it. You've spoken so much about it. You've even compressed so much of it into a TED Talk. And I'm going to ask you to compress it into less than a minute now. What's the one thing you can tell people where they can channel their insight, their passion, the stuff that the grit you say is accessible to all of us, but we really need right now?
So yeah, thank you. I will try to say something that's especially helpful in the current situation, and that is this. When I study really gritty people who come through adversity and failure better than others, one thing that's characteristic is that they understand that there is a lot that they cannot control. They understand that there's chance, and they understand that there's misfortune too. But they choose to also pay attention, and maybe disproportionately pay attention to the things that they can control. And I think what that looks like today is, you don't know what's going to happen in the economy. There's so much you can't control, but you can make your bed, but you can wash the dishes. You can send one kind email. You can unload the dishwasher. You can write in your journal. I think trying to think about and actually take action on the subset of things in the universe that you can control, that's what a gritty person would do right now.